All right, let's talk about population interactions. This is the third video for ecology, so if you haven't watched the other two yet, go watch the other two. But in this video, we're going to look at different roles organisms have in the ecosystem. We're going to look at types of interaction, and specifically, we're going to look at some types of symbiosis. So some questions we want to be able to answer. What is a niche? All right, what does that mean? What are the three main types of interactions between species? We obviously want to be able to describe each one of those. And we want to look at the three kinds of symbiosis. And again, we want to be able to describe what happens in each one of those. So, some ecosystem parts that are going to come into play with this. The ecosystem is all the living and the non-living things in an area, right? We've already talked about that. Two ways we might describe that are biotic factors and abiotic factors. Remember that A in front of a word means the opposite of. So biotic means living factors. Bio means life. Abiotic would mean non-living factors. Biotic factors are pretty easy to identify, like the frogs or the gnats or the mosquitoes or the trees or anything that's living. Abiotic factors, most people think of things like soil or rocks. Maybe a dead fallen tree, but some other things that you might not think of right away are the air currents, right? Which way does the wind blow? How violently? The temperature, the moisture levels, the humidity, right? Those kind of things are also considered abiotic factors and can all be used to describe the ecosystem. Now, where an animal fits into, or where an organism, not just an animal, where an organism fits into the ecosystem, is its niche, all right? And a lot of times people call it a niche, but a niche is another way that we can say that. It's just kind of more accurate. But either way, niche, same thing. When you're looking at the niche, you're talking about what it eats, what eats it, right? So food webs, food chains, what kind of environment it gravitates to, what's its habitat in that environment. We're going to look at how it reproduces. That could be, sexually or asexually. We can look at behavior. We can look at what time of year it reproduces, all of those things, whether it gives birth to live young or if it lays eggs, right? And then we also include in this description any way that the organism impacts the ecosystem. Now, when we start describing those things, we find interactions between organisms that we have to label. And so there's three main kinds of interaction. There's competition, there's predation, and there's symbiosis. Now, competition is something that we've talked a lot about in biology. We talked about it for a couple of weeks when we talked about evolution. We talked about it in terms of in how genes change. We've talked about it a lot. And at this point, it should come as no surprise that competition is the struggle between organisms to live in a habitat that doesn't have enough resources to go around. We identify that as a limited resource habitat. This picture is a great example of it, right? There is not enough water in that little puddle there for all of the animals in that environment. First come, first serve, that's something that they have to deal with. So that's competition. Everybody needs some water, and there's not enough to go around. The same is true of, food, of shelter, whatever it is. Now, predation is probably something that you're familiar with. It's the predator-prey relationship. It's when one organism hunts and kills another organism for food. That's not, rocket science. That's something we've talked a little bit about, something you're probably just familiar with based on your own life experience, things that you already know. There's also symbiosis. Now, symbiosis we are going to talk a little bit about in this video because it may be something that's a little different, right? Predation, we understand. Symbiosis, that's new, and it's got some details with it. So let's talk about those details. Symbiosis is defined as when two organisms interact and at least one of those organisms benefits. So mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism are the three kinds of symbiosis. Now, predator-prey relationship, definitely the predator benefits, definitely the prey, doesn't benefit, but we don't typically put those into the symbiosis category. It's just these three. So leave predation out. So what's mutualism? Let's start with the first one. Mutually beneficial. That's what mutualism is. It's mutually beneficial. Both organisms are going to benefit. So here's a great picture. This is a honeybee, right? And the honeybee is getting a meal, right? It's feeding on the nectar in this plant. And the flower must also be benefiting, right? Because this is the picture under mutualism. So what's the benefit for the flower? Well, you can look right down here at the bottom of the bee here at his legs, and you can see that there's a bunch of pollen that is collected right there. And it's also on his, on the little hairs on his legs right there, and on his face. But there's a big, pollen basket on this bee. As the bee goes from flower to flower, the flowers get pollinated. The bee gets a meal, the flowers get pollinated. Both species benefit. This is mutualism. The second one we looked at is commensalism. Commensalism is when one animal benefits and the other isn't even probably aware that that animal is around, right? It's not helped or harmed. So a hole in a tree is a great example, right? At some point, this limb died, fell off the tree, left a hole behind. This bird has moved in, right? It's got some shelter. It's got a home. It's definitely benefiting, right? It's got a place to raise its young. It's got a place to get out of the weather. It's a good benefit for the bird. Is the tree affected at all? No. The tree doesn't know the bird's there. Nothing the bird's doing is going to mess with the tree. The bark has healed over this hole. The tree doesn't even know it's there. So this is commensalism. One organism is helped. The other doesn't even, know what's going on. And the last form of symbiosis is parasitism. And in parasitism, one organism is helped, the parasite, the mosquito in this picture, and the other is harmed, right? And we call that the host. So obviously here, the mosquito is benefiting, right? It's getting a meal. You can see that meal because this mosquito is kind of translucent, transparent there. And, the organism, the host, is losing blood. So at a base level, right, it's just losing the blood. That's the harm. Other harms can occur with parasites, right? Parasites can be vectors for disease transmission, right? Mosquitoes are infamous for the fact that they carry malaria. Not every mosquito does, but some do. So in best case scenario, the parasite gets a meal and the host just loses some blood. Worst case scenario, the mosquito still gets a meal, but it also passes malaria onto this organism and it doesn't end up or it ends up being harmed in the long run. So 3 main kinds of interaction there, right? Make sure you know those. This is a pretty short video. We're really just looking at some vocabulary and being able to apply that vocabulary to a description. So not a long video, but hopefully now you can describe a niche. You can look at 3 main interaction types between species and the 3 kinds of symbiosis, right? If you have any questions, let me know.